I would now like to give the word to Professor José Maria Sison, the founding chairman of the Communist Party of the Philippines and its armed wing, the New People's Army. Both organizations are currently included in terrorist lists as a result of their ongoing armed struggle against the government of what they describe as a semi-colonial and semi-feudal ruling system under US imperialist control and with the comprador big bourgeoisie, landlords and bureaucrat capitalists as ruling classes.
I am honored and delighted to avail of this alternative parliament to expose the unjust socio-economic, political and ideological interest behind the terrorist labeling and listing of the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, the New People's Army, NPA, your speaker, and in effect the entire struggle of the Filipino people for national liberation and democracy. In this connection, I wish to present the highlights of the revolutionary history and circumstances of the Filipino people, the CPP, the NPA, and the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, and my historical and current role, which has resulted in my inclusion in the so-called terrorist blacklist of the US and the EU, among others. The interest behind the terrorist listing of the National Liberation Movement in the Philippines are chiefly those of the US among the imperialist powers. The terrorist listing seeks to demonize the movement and justify the use of violence and deception against the people and social activists in order to preserve and promote the socio-economic interests of the US monopoly bourgeoisie. This globally hegemonic class wants to continue drawing super profits from the working people and oppressed nations and peoples and seeks to crush their resistance. There is the illusion of democracy in the Philippines, but this is merely the competition of political factions of the same exploiting classes. Since 9/11, the US has used the pretext of combating Al-Qaeda in order to proclaim and carry out a perpetual, borderless war of terror on countries assertive of national independence and on national liberation movements. To justify the extraordinary and boundless use of violence and go beyond appropriate police measures against common crimes, the US has used the metaphor of war to commit grievous criminal violations of basic democratic rights, engage in foreign military intervention, and wage wars of aggression. Of course, the US has a motive for the use of oppression, aggression, and occupation. This is to maintain and expand its dominant share of the global and regional markets, the sources of cheap labor and raw materials, especially energy, the fields of investment, and the spheres of influence. The NPA has never engaged in any cross-border action against the US or any other country, but the US and the Filipino puppets connive in trying to subject the CPP, NPA, and the NDFP chief political consultant to the jurisdiction of the US and other imperialist powers. Even before the US had made clear what are its interests, in the ideological field, it has propagated the notion that history cannot go any farther than capitalism and liberal democracy. In the socioeconomic field, it has used the neoliberal policy of free market globalization to accelerate the accumulation and concentration of capital and attack the rights of the working people. In the political field, it has trampled upon the national sovereignty of underdeveloped countries and has violated human rights on a wide scale. In the military field, it has asserted the imperial authority to engage wantonly in military intervention and aggression. We reestablished the CPP on December 26, 1968, through a Congress that ratified the Constitution and Program for a People's Democratic Revolution and elected the Central Committee, which in turn elected me as the chairman. We started with only 84 members and candidate members of the party, but we were already leading thousands of members of trade unions and organizations of youth, urban poor, and peasants. With a revolutionary theory and a democratic political program, we were confident of growing in strength through revolutionary struggle. A few months after the re-establishment of the party, we founded the New People's Army on March 29, 1969. We, the proletarian revolutionaries from Manila, linked up with the healthy elements, with the healthy remnants of the old People's Army that had a mass base of 80,000 peasants in Tarlac province. We started with only 9 automatic rifles and 26 inferior firearms, like single-shot rifles and handguns. We were determined to wage revolutionary armed struggle because the Marcos regime had been escalating violence against the workers, urban poor, the peasants, and the youth in numerous incidents since 1965. These included massacres and brutal disruption of worker strikes and protest rallies. In 1968, I was subjected to a knife attack by covert agents of the regime. From year to year, there were increasing signs that Marcos would perpetuate himself in power through military force and other extraordinary means. The U.S. was supporting his regime with increasing military assistance and training the police for surveillance and crowd control. In 1971, Marcos masterminded the Plaza Miranda bombing and scapegoated the CPP, the NPA, and his arch political rival Benigno Aquino in order to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. This was a direct preparation for his proclamation of martial law and imposition of a fascist dictatorship on the people in 1972. My capture in 1977 did not lessen the momentum of the revolutionary movement. Together with so many other gross human rights violations committed by the fascist dictatorship, the various forms of torture that I suffered in prison and my steadfast defiance helped to inspire the revolutionary forces and people to intensify their struggle. I was released from prison and went back to government service, to the State University of the Philippines to teach political science in the Asian Center of Graduate Studies. Then I decided to go on a global university lecture tour in the latter half of 1986. While I was still in the Asia-Pacific region, the military establishment did not like what I was saying abroad in the exercise of my fundamental right to think and speak freely, and pressed Cory Aquino to cancel my passport and force my return to the Philippines. She yielded to the pressure of the military, canceled my passport, and went along with the filing of a false charge of subversion against me in 1988. Thus, I had to apply for political asylum in the Netherlands in order to avoid the sword of the military in Manila. The regime was vociferous in seeking to stop me from exercising my democratic right to speak freely and in preconditioning the resumption of negotiations with the capitulation and pacification of the revolutionary forces and the people. Thus, for the purpose of blackmail and pressure, the Arroyo regime requested the U.S. government to designate the CPP, NPA, and myself as the NDFP chief political consultant as foreign terrorist in November 2001. The Dutch government likewise designated me as a terrorist and further curtailed my fundamental rights. Within 24 hours after my designation by the U.S., the Dutch government, for no clear reason, followed suit like a tiny puppet. The Dutch government designated me as a terrorist and further curtailed my fundamental rights, froze my bank account, and terminated all my social benefits, including living allowance, housing, health insurance, and pension. Subsequently, it was the prime movement in having the Council of European Union put me in the terrorist blacklist of the European Union in October 2002. Upon the request of the Manila government, which supplied false allegations against me, the Dutch government raided the NDFP office in Utrecht and the residences of NDFP negotiators and consultants, and arrested me and put me in solitary confinement from August 28 to September 13, 2007, on trumped-up charges of murder. My arrest and incarceration certainly reminded me of the treatment I got from the Marcos regime when I was arrested in 1977. I do not carry any rancor that prevents me from participating in the peace negotiations, especially because I have won my cases in court against the trumped-up charges of murder and the terrorist blacklisting. But I admonish my powerful detractors not to use blackmail and dirty tricks to pressure the NDFP or anyone to yield to the scheme of capitulation and pacification in the form of indefinite ceasefire agreement that puts away serious negotiations on basic social, economic, and political reforms. The Manila government should retract its previous request to the US and other governments to designate and list the CPP, NPA, and the NDFP chief political consultant as terrorists. It should stop making servile, silly, and shameless statements that the foreign governments have the sovereign right to claim jurisdiction over Philippine entities and their activities within the Philippines. It is best for the contending and negotiating parties to concentrate on serious negotiations and arrive at agreements that are beneficial to the entire Filipino people. Let me stress that the Manila government, the US government, and other foreign governments are violators of human rights and are reprehensible for libeling, and listing the CPP, NPA, and the NDFP chief political consultant as terrorists, and for filing false criminal charges against me. By doing so, they have also damaged and delayed the peace negotiations between the NDFP and the Manila government. They have exposed the limits of their claims to democracy. And more candidly speaking, the fundamental rottenness of ruling systems that are controlled by exploiting classes, such as the monopoly bourgeoisie in imperialist countries and the big compradors and landlords in a client state like the Philippines. The US and other imperialist powers are condemnable for using as pretext the so-called war on terror to encroach on the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries and designate political forces like the CPP and NPA and individuals like me as terrorists without any proof of any terrorist act that is within the jurisdiction of any of the imperialist countries. I was put on a terrorist blacklist of the Dutch government and then the European Union, denied basic rights and deprived of all social benefits and subjected to stigmatization and incitement to hatred and violence without my being informed of any act of terrorism imputed to me, without any proper investigation, and without respecting my right to counsel and the right to go to court prior to the terrorist listing and prior to the punitive actions taken against me. With a deep sense of gratitude to my lawyers, the solidarity activists, and the people in various countries, I am pleased about having won in 2007 before the Dutch courts my case against the false charges of murder, and in 2009 before the European Court of Justice my case against my inclusion in the terrorist blacklist of the European Union after 7 long years of litigation. But I'm always reminded by myself and by many others with a sense of justice and fairness that I should not have been persecuted in the first place, and that those who have the most power and the most wealth in my country and their imperialist allies abroad can still get back to me at any time and brazenly persecute me again. Indeed, I remain vulnerable to those powerful interests that wish to silence me. They persist in trying to stop me from exercising my fundamental rights to think, write, and speak freely in support of the exploited and oppressed people. I'm always reminded of the fact that I have been unjustly and unfairly refused residence by the Dutch government for more than 24 years, despite the fact that I have been a recognized political refugee since 1992 with a spouse who has legal residence in the Netherlands and with 2 children who are naturalized Dutch with Dutch partners, and despite the fact that I have the fundamental right to be presumed innocent in the absence of any criminal conviction by any court. Worst of all, the Dutch authorities have never taken the steps to prosecute those who tried to assassinate me in 1999 and 2000, assassins sent in here by the Estrada regime and his police general, Pampilo Lacson. Despite the evidence presented from 2000 to 2007, the Dutch police themselves uncovered evidence on the assassination plot against me while they were investigating the false criminal charges against me in 2007. They got hold of the passport of 2 of the members of the assassination team, and they were able to verify the Visa card used by one of the projected assassins. Despite the dismal and unjust character of bourgeois democracy in imperialist countries, I'm happy about the rise of the democratic mass movement of the people in Europe against the worsening economic and social crisis, against the growing repressive conditions, against imperial support for counter-revolutions, and against wars of aggression. I welcome and support the spread of the Occupy movement, the Indignado mass protests in Spain, the popular uprising in Greece, and all other forms of resistance in various capitalist countries. I stand in solidarity with the rising international democratic mass movement of the 99% against the 1%. The people of the world have common aspirations and need to support each other in waging anti-imperialist and democratic struggles. The broad masses of the people must resolutely and militantly wage struggles to defend their democratic rights and interests. They are the real source of democracy. They must win the struggle for democracy, whether the aim is to achieve national liberation or socialism. The proletariat and people in both the developed and underdeveloped countries have a common basis for solidarity and mutual support against imperialism and reaction. Their united struggle can lead to a fundamentally new and better world of greater freedom, democracy, social justice, all-round development, and peace. Thank you.